Now for our event, beginning with a short video of some wonderful artwork from Louisa Albani's beautiful pamphlet concerning William Blake and the Ancients. It's about 5 minutes long, and then we'll be having David Mullin and John in conversation, and David is going to tell us about William Blake and the Ancients in Search of Paradise. Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name's John. I'm one of the trustees of the Blake Society, as you probably know. As Stephen mentioned, the artwork that we all just enjoyed is from Louisa Amelia Albani's latest pamphlet, which is called In Search of Paradise, William Blake at Old Wyldes, Hampstead. Hopefully, lots of you are already aware of Louisa's work. She's appeared in 2 issues of Bala that we've done so far, and the new pamphlet we did a feature on in the latest issue, issue 4, and it focuses very much on the end of the sort of end period of Blake's life, his relationship with the ancients, and his visits to Old Wyldes, being the farmhouse in Hampstead that John Linnell was living in with his family at the time. I urge you all to get a copy. Where's mine? I'm never quite sure whether Zoom's showing it the right way around or not, but there you are. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of work. And I don't know whether some of you probably noticed in the video there, it incorporates quite a lot of drawings that Linnell did of Blake, which Louisa got permission from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge to incorporate into her own artwork in quite interesting and clever ways, I think. Yeah, you can get hold of it from her website, which is nightbirdpress.com. And if you're in London, it's also available in the London Review Bookshop and Treadwell's. And if you go to her website, there's a list of other bookshops in other towns and other places you can get hold of it as well. I urge you to do so. The other thing about the latest pamphlet is it features a written contribution from one David Mullin, who was a new name for me, and I'm pleased to say that through his contribution to the pamphlet and then the feature in issue 4 of Vala, we've persuaded him to join us this evening to give our talk. So brief biog of David that I have here is that he is an archaeologist, a writer, a fell runner, and a musician. And actually, I went and listened to some pieces of music that David created earlier, and they're very beautiful, sort of atmospheric, kind of ambient works. But he is writing a book on Samuel Palmer. He'll hopefully tell us. I think he's towards the end of writing that. So an ideal person to talk to us about that period of Blake's life when he befriended Palmer and the other ancients. We'll have a period for questions after David's finished his talk. So you can put questions in the chat if you like, or wait until David's finished, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. But for now, very happy to hand over to David Mullin. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I've got some pictures to show you. So, as John said, I'm an archaeologist, and I'm writing a book about Samuel Palmer, which for complicated reasons, which I'm not going to go into. So you can ask me about them in the chat at the end, maybe. But it's quite complicated, quite involved, so I'm not going to talk about that now. What I am going to talk about is these two chaps in big hats, and hopefully sort of, fill you in on some of their relationship. What I want to do is I want to talk about Palmer and give you a brief-ish overview of his life. Some of you may be familiar with his work, some of you probably won't be. And then I'll come back and talk about the relationship specifically between Palmer and Blake and the group of artists that call themselves the Ancients, who included people like Richmond and various other people. So we've got a little bit of information about Palmer. He's not particularly brilliantly known as an artist. There's a biography from 1987 about him by Raymond Lister. We've got 2 volumes of letters. We've got quite a lot of paintings, quite a lot of etchings, and a very good, fairly recent biography by William Vaughan called Shadows on the Wall, which goes into a lot of detail about Palmer. So I recommend that. It's quite big. You can pick up the Raymond Lister biography quite cheaply secondhand, so there's information out there. So briefly, I'm going to go through his life a little bit. Like Blake, Palmer was born in London. He was born in Surrey Square in Walworth, just off the Old Kent Road. This is his house. He was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 27th of January, 1805. And that day is dedicated to St. Angela Merici, who's the patron saint of the sick, the disabled, and those grieving the loss of parents. He was an Aquarius. So he had, his family were quite middle class. They were, his father was a bookseller. And they were, they were relatively well off. They were kind of, people with means. Let's call them that. And Surrey Square is a nice square. Went there a few years ago. There's an unofficial blue plaque. There's an artist living next door having work done on the left of the screen there. And it's perfectly nice and very, very much a contrast to the Old Kent Road, which is not too far away. It's quite a genteel little square, this. But by the time Palmer is 4, family move to Houndsditch. This is on the left slide, the Moonshine Saloon. It wasn't the Moonshine Saloon when he moved when he was 4 years old. It was quite an insalubrious part of London. Houndsditch possibly being named from the practice of the inhabitants of the City of London throwing dead dogs into the city ditch in this part of town. So they seem to have kind of fallen on their uppers slightly. This is discussed in quite a lot of detail by William Vaughan. They move again to Broad Street in Bloomsbury, and this is on the right here, in 1820. Again, this building doesn't survive. This is now the Cuban Embassy, which is why you can see a car parked outside with the registration plate to Cuba. This is not the building that Palmer lived in. This was rebuilt in 1820, in the early part of the 20th century. And yeah, so his early houses don't survive. But it was Broad Street, this house on the right, which is next to the Shaftesbury Theatre, which is where he was living when he met Blake. So Palmer was home educated. He didn't like school much. Brought up largely by his father and his nurse, Mary Ward. This is an image of him aged about 14 by Henry Walter, a friend of his. Mary Ward was quite an important figure in his life. She gave him a copy of Jacob Tonson's version of Milton, which he absolutely loved. Milton was a big influence on him. And there's a memory recorded from his early childhood where he says that she used to read from Edward Young's paraphrase of the Book of Job. We might come back to the Book of Job in a minute. And the quote that he always remembers from it is, "Vain man whose vision of a moment made, dream of a dream and shadow of a shade." And he said he often tried to paint those shadows. So his mother died when he was 13. He was obviously, 13-year-old, quite an important time in anyone's life. He was distraught, had a very difficult relationship with death thereafter. Brought up by his father and his nurse increasingly important in his life. He sells his first painting age 14, so looking like this, looking like a cheeky young chap. And he had paintings hung in the Royal Academy exhibition that year too. So he's quite a precocious little chap. This is one of his early paintings. It's a few years, a couple of years after this. Pretty good, nice watercolor, heavily influenced by the watercolors at the time. And yeah, so very, very kind of precocious young talent. And by the time he's 17, he comes to the attention of John Linnell. Linnell, as a lot of you will know, was a patron of William Blake. who was at the time living at Fountain Court, so towards the end of Blake's life. Linnell had quite a long relationship with Blake, was a patron, helped him out, organised all sorts of things, commissioned all sorts of things, which we'll talk about maybe in a minute. And Palmer, as I said earlier on, was living not too far from Fountain Court, on the other side of Covent Garden, on Broad Street in Bloomsbury. So the first time Palmer meets Blake is when Palmer's aged 19 in 1824, which I only just realised is 200 years ago this year. So that's something to celebrate. Palmer's 19. Linnell takes him into Fountain Court, up the stairs, and the image on the left here, the Job continually, is lying on the table, being worked on. And Palmer just is completely gobsmacked by it. Why wouldn't you be if you wandered into somebody's house you didn't know and you saw they were working on that? And Job is quite an important. I mean, it was for Blake, and it is for Palmer. The idea of being tested by God, and for no fault of your own. And coming through all of those things, all of those trials and tribulations to eventually kind of work out that your life, it wasn't your fault after all, and life isn't too bad if you're lucky. So Blake became a massive influence. Palmer's only 19. He's been painting for a while. This is a sketchbook page from the 1824 sketchbook. You can see the obvious parallels there with things from Job, and sort of some Blakean influences starting creeping in. And I'll come back to their relationship and their artistic relationship. Oh no, I didn't mean to go forward. I'll come back to that relationship in a bit later and show you some more images and talk about that in a bit more detail. So in 1827, Palmer's father decides to give up bookselling and takes up a position as a preacher at a Baptist chapel in a place called Opford near Sevenoaks in Kent, south of London. It's about 20 miles or so south of London, and moves the entire family to a village called Shoreham, which is just slightly further up the river Darent towards London. It's very picturesque, still is a very picturesque little village. And they move here. This is the Ivy Cottage. This is where they moved to initially. It's a very nice little cottage, and Palmer painted it. This is in Yale. You can see, if I can do my clever, can I do my clever thing? Yes, I can. I should be able to do that. You can see here a little rustically nailed the gate and people queuing up to get in. So that's Ivy Cottage. That's where he lives initially, and paints paintings in the garden. The left, this figure in the hat might be Palmer himself, and people in red, women wrapped in red. There's another one here. Are something that he's a motif of his. And the image on the right, in the Shoreham garden, is probably in the same garden, and you can see he's becoming a little bit more impressionistic. His work is kind of taking on a slightly more less formal anyway. So they move to the Waterhouse. His father eventually finds a house which is rather nice, lovely Queen Anne style house, and they start to settle down. There's a plaque on the Waterhouse which gets Samuel Palmer's dates wrong. Palmer died in 1881, not 1884, and this is where Palmer really starts to take off. His art becomes really quite something radically different and different from Blake, very visionary, it's the period that he's known for. Paints a lot locally, real scenes, imagined scenes. I'll come back to this because it's worth talking about in some more detail, but just to keep on with his life for a moment. This is a self-portrait he painted. This is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, probably around 20-ish. You can see he's been slightly careless with the chalk here. There's some splashes down here, but I think it's just a gut feeling of mine. I don't know whether there's really any evidence. I feel like he's dressing himself slightly archaically in this, in a reference to Blake's portraits, which are in which Blake is dressed in a similar manner, and that's just a kind of gut feeling about that. He paints lots of things. He writes. He particularly paints the moon. He's very well known for his moon paintings, and this is where he also becomes acquainted with his friends. Start calling down to Shoreham from London, and they start forming this group called the Ancients. And again, I'll come back to who those people are and what their relationships are in a moment. So here's more of Palmer. He goes from being, I'll go back one slide, he goes from being this slightly callow youth to a slightly less callow youth. The portrait on the right by George Richmond is slightly messianic, and becomes even more messianic as time goes on. George Richmond was a very good friend of Palmer's, but you can see kind of, living in Shoreham, away from London, away from society, Palmer becomes kind of, becomes a bit of a hippie. Grows his hair, grows a beard. People didn't wear beards in the 1820s, late 1820s. And you can see on the right-hand picture there, he's got over collar length hair. He's got, this is long, unkempt. His clothes are all being made for him. I'll go back to this picture. His clothes are all being made for him, so he can fit everything he needs in his pockets. He's renowned for wearing this massive cloak, which he just fills with stuff, so he can go sketching and not have to carry loads of things with him. Here's one of his moons. This is in the British Museum. This is kind of an amalgam of Shoreham and various other places, but a rustic moving through the landscape with the moon spitting out moonlight, and there's a very sort of, you can see the Blake influence here, but you can see he's moving beyond Blake and into something very distinctive and very much his own kind of style. Palmer's in Shoreham when Blake dies in 1827, doesn't go to the funeral. He's got a very interesting relationship with death. He just can't handle going to funerals. He can't handle grief. He can't handle the whole thing, which really creates problems for him later on in his life. As well as being in Shoreham, he goes on some sketching trips to Wales. This is a waterfall in North Wales. So he's capable of doing this visionary, impressionistic, moony kind of stuff, but he's also technically very, very good. I mean, this is the treatment of water in this is pretty remarkable. It was on this trip he met Crab Robinson, who knew Blake, and they talked about Blake all day while wandering around painting waterfalls. So it's another connection. And he was starting to paint more kind of classic scenes, more kind of landscape scenes. But there's a kind of dreaminess here as well. There's still the sun setting behind the castle, and there's still some romanticism involved here. So this is Samuel Palmer's block of flats. So he spends his time in Shoreham. He starts getting a bit restless. By the age of 30, he moves back to London and buys a 10-bedroomed house on Grove Street in Lisson Grove in 1832. Again, this house doesn't survive. It's turned into this monstrosity. As someone who likes, well, let's rephrase that, appreciates brutalist architecture, even I don't like this. But it was in a part of London which was quite artistic, quite a lot of artists living in that part of town at the time. And this is now the Mallory Street development, which is not nice. But but he's still seeing John Linnell, who lives not that far away in Portchester Terrace, which is near Hyde Park. Palmer has known the Linnell family for quite a long time, and he's taken a particular fondness for Linnell's daughter Hannah, and they fall in love and marry in 1837. Oops, hang on, where am I going? In this place, Portchester Terrace, which is Linnell's purpose-built studio, rather grand. Linnell was doing rather well for himself at the time. You can see friezes of the muses over the window, separate entrance into the studio where he sold his paintings. So this is where Palmer and Hannah Linnell fell in love, got married, and whiz off for a 2-year honeymoon in Italy. They're only supposed to go for a year. They end up staying 2 years, much to the annoyance of the Linnells, who want their daughter back. But Palmer is painting, the classic scenes that he's read about in literature. He's very well read. He's going to places that he's read about in Virgil, and he's painting more kind of tamer style paintings, more topographical, still quite colourful. But he's thinking about his career. He's thinking about becoming a professional painter, and he's thinking about what he's going to do when he comes back from London and having a career as an artist. That's another Italian, lots of colourful sky, lots of stuff going on there. So they come back to London. They moved back to Lisson Grove. They have a son called Thomas Moore. Moved to a house in Kensington, at Love Lane, which is now Victoria Road, one of the most expensive streets in the country. They have another child, a daughter, who at the age of 3 falls ill. She might have been poisoned by a poisonous plant in their garden and subsequently dies. Palmer's father dies the following year, and so Palmer is, not having a great time. So they move to this rather grander house in Juro Place, Kensington, which is just not too far from where they were living in Victoria Road, but rather nicer, more kind of a gentleman's dwelling. And he starts to teach. He starts to teach painting, especially to the young ladies who complain about the lack of space for their crinolines in his house. But he doesn't really like living in London. He's missing Shoreham, he's missing Italy. But his art's going okay. He's elected member of the Old Watercolour Society. Dickens approaches him to illustrate Pictures from Italy, 1846. He becomes a member of the Etching Club. He becomes a member of the Old Watercolour Society. He's still exhibiting at the Royal Academy now and then. And so he's doing okay. But this kind of mid-period Palmer is considered by a lot of people not to be his best. It's quite, apart from the skies, it's quite tame. It's not particularly visionary. It's very much of its time, but you can still see there's stuff going on here. This is an illustration, a painting inspired by Pilgrim's Progress, which was a big influence on him. And you can see there's bits of Italy, there's probably bits of Wales in here. There's all sorts of stuff going on, but it's not to the popular taste of the time. It's a bit too lively, it's a bit too colourful. He's criticised for his prismatic skies. And he's doing okay. He's not massively successful, but he's not failing either. He's managing to keep his head above water. He has another son, 1853, Alfred Herbert. This is him. He emigrated to Canada at the start of the 20th century. This is him in about 1920, looking very pleased with himself for having shot a rabbit. There we are. And A.H. Palmer, Alfred Herbert, is responsible for Palmer's legacy. He was in control of it. He wrote a biography after Palmer's death, and it's A.H. Palmer who really has, until quite recently, been the kind of the dominant voice about Palmer's life and work. Oh, and the thing about H. Palmer, which I go back and tell you, the lovely thing about H. Palmer is he said he lived until 1932 and is buried in Vancouver in Canada. And he remembered learning songs from Songs of Innocence on his mother's knee, his mother being Hannah Palmer, who had learned them from William Blake himself. So that's a really fantastic link. And he died in 1932. So someone who learned Blake's songs from his mum died last century. Yeah, that's quite remarkable to me. I think that's quite an amazing thing. So Palmer discovers etching. He starts experimenting in etching. He's tried all sorts of medium. He's mostly painting in watercolors at this time. He thinks about etching again, maybe, I think pretty much influenced by Blake, the whole printing process, although he's obviously not doing the kind of printing the printmaking that Blake was doing. This is more classic kind of etching on copper plate. And he becomes a member of the etching club. You can see that this is kind of he's known for biting his plates deep. He spends a lot of time on these etchings. I mean, look at the sky. He spends a lot of time on these kinds of things, and he starts to think about, well, he might like to do etching rather than paint. His father-in-law, John Linnell, is doing quite well, buys some land in Surrey, a place called Redhill, builds a massive villa there. Palmer's life isn't going quite so well. His other son, Thomas More, contracts scarlet fever, and Palmer, who's also asthmatic, decides that they need to move out of London somewhere healthy. So they move to this house, which isn't too far away from Linnell's new house at Redhill in Surrey. This is on Leith Hill. And it looks perfectly nice. I went and visited on a nice summer's day, bumped into the lady who lived there. He told me there was a Palmer painting hanging up in there. It was a reproduction. So they moved to the countryside. It's nice, it's inspiring, but it's damp and it's exposed. The son's health declines, and a few months after moving in, Thomas More dies, aged 19, and Palmer just goes completely to bits. He goes to pieces on it. Thomas More was his favourite son. He was invested a lot of time into him. He was like, he was just his precious thing, and he dies at 19. And Palmer was in absolute bits about it. This is More's grave at Abbinger, just down the road from where they were living. Interestingly, this stone was picked by Gilchrist, who was Blake's biographer, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Palmer, in bits, can't face returning to London, can't face returning to the house that they were renting in, is all over the place. His wife eventually decides that they're going to move to another house, still in Redhill, still just up the road from her father, who's supporting them through this time, both emotionally and financially. So they moved to this place called Firs Hill House. The left-hand photograph was taken by Alfred Palmer, Palmer's of the Sun. The right-hand photograph is as close as I got to it about 5 years ago. This part of Surrey is quite a lot of rich people live there. You don't want to go bungling down their driveways with a camera saying, "Oh, I just want to take pictures of Samuel Palmer's house." So, and this is where Palmer lives out the rest of his days. It's a Victorian villa. He doesn't like it. Palmer kind of squirrels himself away in a room. His wife invites all her society friends to have dinners and lunches. He just becomes a grumpy old man, and carries on painting and etching. He can still see from the garden of this place. You can still see across to Surrey where the old house was, where his son died. So he is commissioned to produce an illustrated version of Milton's L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, and decides he's going to illustrate it with etchings, because he's now decided that etching is the thing. He loves etching. He loves the fact that you don't have to mix colours. He loves the fact that it's completely unforgiving media. And I think he also loves it because it reminds him of Blake. So he starts slowly etching some illustrations. You can see here there's sheep in the background here. They look quite like sheep that Blake would illustrate, I think. There's a cart going up the hill. There's a tower with a light on. There's a moon. These are supposed to be druidical stones on the horizon. Whether they are or not, who knows? But again, that might be a reference back to Blake and all of the trilithons from Stonehenge that crop up in Blake every now and again. And this is based on this tower on Leith Hill, not too far, about 10 minutes walk from the house in which his eldest son died. So it's a romanticized version, obviously, but you can see that's clearly the model for that illustration. And Palmer is so interested in etching and is so good at it, and is becoming people are becoming aware of his work, that an entire chapter in the 1876 book Etching and Etchers by P.G. Hamerton is dedicated to Palmer, who's described as one of the foremost etchers in the country, working at that time in the 1870s. And Palmer carries on. He wants to publish a translation of Virgil's Eclogues, and is told that the translation's all right, but it'd sell better if he illustrated it. So he decides to illustrate that with etchings as well. But he's getting quite old. So the photograph on the left, he's clutching his copy of Virgil. This is he's about 65, 66 here, I think. Can't do the maths. I should have written it down. And on the right, this is by Charles West Cope, who was a neighbour, also an artist, fairly well known at the time. And this was an etching which was published just after Palmer's death, a couple of years after his death. So you can see he's gone, it's gone from a callow youth to a sprightly young chap about town, and now he's sort of in decline. He's wearing glasses. He was actually, an aside, I'm in the process of trying to arrange to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to look at his glasses, because I need to look through Samuel Palmer's glasses. Don't ask me why. I might tell you in the chat. But Palmer also owned his own glasses, but he also owned a pair of glasses that William Blake gave to him. So he had Blake's glasses. I need to look through these glasses. Anyway, so he's getting old. 1881, 1880, the winter of 1880, 1881 is quite a bad one. It does his health no good. And on the 24th of May, 1881, Palmer dies in his bed at home in Red Hill, and is buried in the corner of the church at Red Hill. And this is his grave. You can see the gravestone is identical in design to his son's up at Abinger. This is, it's a nice quiet spot. I've been there several times now. And 1881, there's a posthumous exhibition at the Fine Arts Society. It's his first solo show. And there's 120 works altogether exhibited there. His son goes on to write his life and letters, published in 1892. And basically, until the 1920s, Palmer isn't really very well known. There's a exhibition of, it's called an exhibition of drawing, etchings and woodcuts by Samuel Palmer and the disciples of William Blake at the V&A in 1926, which is the big thing that gets him recognised again, but mostly for his etchings. His paintings didn't really become popular until the 1960s. And usually he is described as a disciple of, or a follower of, or even a pupil of. I don't think he ever was a pupil of William Blake, and that's how people have regarded him rather than as an artist in his own right. But I think, as you'll see in a moment, there's quite significant differences between Blake and Palmer. And they, although there's, Blake was always important to Palmer and his life. Okay, sip of water, pause for breath. So I want to go on to talk about Ancient and Blake and Palmer. And one of the key people in that relationship is George Richmond. Here he is in 1830 and 1840. Handsome chap, and Richmond was present at Palmer's death in 1881, and he was also present at Blake's death 54 years earlier. And they, both Palmer and Richmond, knew Blake, and both Palmer and Richmond were friends from childhood. So there's a link for you. Richmond was much more successful than Palmer was. You may have come across some of his work. He painted a really famous portrait of Charlotte Bronte. He painted portraits. He was a portrait painter rather than a landscape painter. George Gilbert Scott, Elizabeth Gaskell's, nobility, clergy. But his early work was described by Raymond Lister, an art historian, as so close to Blake's that it's almost plagiaristic. And this is Abel the Shepherd by George Richmond. And you can see Lister's point. These sheep, Palmer and Richmond, took their sheep from Blake. Little bat flitting around, bit of a moon. But the figure painting is straight out of Blake, isn't it? It's just so reminiscent of Blake's treatment of the figure. So Palmer and Richmond friends, and they were the most active of a group of people who coalesced around each other and around Blake. And just I'll go through their names and give you some illustrations of them and their work. So this is John Giles, who is Samuel Palmer's cousin. Giles wasn't an artist; he was a stockbroker, but he was friends with a lot of artists, and he admired, and this is a quote, the grandeur and the superior wisdom of the ancients. By which he meant, the Greeks and the Romans, not his own little party of friends, but I'm sure he probably meant them too. And Richmond was a good friend of his all his life, and Palmer would spend Christmas Day with John Giles every year. Without fail, they had Christmas lunch together, and they were cousins and very good friends, and appreciated the finer things in life. The left-hand portrait here, drawn by William Blake Richmond, who's George Richmond's son, named after, you guessed it. So this is Frederick Tatham's drawings. So Frederick Tatham was a Royal Academy student, was a painter and a sculptor. His work wasn't particularly influenced by Blake, but he looked after Catherine after Blake died, is notorious for allegedly, I don't know, Blake scholars, you can argue this, destroying Blake's work, thinking that he owned, thinking it was created by the devil. But he edited Blake's letters, which he also illustrated, and these were published after his death, about 1905, I think. But this brilliant portrait of Catherine is a Tatton. Welby Sherman was another ancient. We know very little about him. He engraved some plates based on Palmer and based on Richmond's work. This is one. It's basically a Palmer painting that he then made into an etching. It's not particularly skillful. The sky is not great, and the treatment of the figure is Palmer's, not Sherman's. But the thing we do know about Sherman is that in 1836, Palmer's brother William lost £500 of his inheritance in a series of bad bets with Sherman. And Sherman then fled to France with the money and wasn't heard from again. So that's probably enough for Welby Sherman. Henry Walter on the right here is also a slightly shadowy figure. Richmond painted this portrait in 1829, I think, but that says 1849. But anyway, Henry Walter died in 1849. So that died May 28, 1849 is what the picture's saying. And according to notes written by Richmond, Walter's paintings were marked by high artistic qualities and fine sentiment, but we don't really know much more than that about him. Francis Oliver Finch, slightly older than Palmer, was a student of John Varley's, who was also a friend of John Linnell. A friend of John Linnell taught John Linnell to paint, but had continued to be a friend of his for the rest of his life. Admired Blake, but went on to do these kinds of not particularly inspiring. Not particularly inspiring landscapes of their time. Nothing particularly visionary, or even, I'd argue, particularly interesting in this kind of stuff. And the Blake isn't even mentioned once in his wife's memoir of his life, so probably not so much a Blake influence, but a reasonably successful artist in his time. Possibly the most colourful ancient was Edward Calvert. He was in the Navy, went to school in Plymouth, went to the Royal Academy, knew Blake before he knew Palmer, and was probably, of all of the ancients, the closest to Blake emotionally and kind of in terms of friendship. And there's, Calvert's early work in particular were a lot of wood engravings, very Blake-like, and sort of very kind of, you can see parallels between this and particularly Blake's work for Thornton's Virgil and the woodcuts in that. Richmond, like Richmond, Calvert was a lifelong friend of Palmer as well, but Calvert went strange later in his life, started to turn towards paganism, was trying to unite the teachings of Socrates and Christ, which Palmer called his naughty disobedient heresies. And Calvert is alleged, and probably did, to have erected an altar to the great god Pan in his garden in Hampton Court. So probably the most literally inspired by Blake in that sense of the lot of them. And so this group of artists, they would regularly call on Blake in Fountain Court. They kind of hung out together. They would go to Fountain Court, which they called the House of the Interpreter. They saw Blake as the interpreter from Pilgrim's Progress, someone who could give you access to wisdom. And they used to kiss the doorbell pull before they rang it, allegedly. So, they used to regularly call on Blake. And I mentioned earlier that Palmer moved to Shoreham. This is one of Palmer's images of Shoreham. The church is down here. Palmer lived in a house, I think it's this one here. I think that's the Waterhouse. This is the River Darren going down to Sevenoaks. And it's a nice valley, very English, very pastoral. It's a lovely place. This group also called down, as well as calling on Blake, called down to Shoreham to see Palmer. And they started calling themselves the Ancients. They grew their hair, they drank cider, they painted the moon. They didn't ever live together, but they did spend extended periods of time together. And Calvert described them as brothers in art, brothers in love, and brothers in that for which love and art subsist, the ideal, the kingdom within. And so they were quite spiritual as well. They were, very much into kind of Christian mysticism, and were kind of very very interested in art, literature, poetry. One of their keywords was poetry and sentiment. They were, that's where they were at. So they visited Blake, they visited Palmer down in Shoreham in Kent, and they visited John Linnell in this house, which is now called Old Wyldes. It was called Collins's Farm at the time. And I've written about this in the pamphlet, so I'm not going to tell you what's in that, because you need to buy the pamphlet, obviously. But briefly, Blake in Fountain Court would often walk from Fountain Court through London up to Hampstead Heath. This is on Hampstead Heath, Old Wyldes. And as Broad Street was in the way of his walk, he'd call in on the young Master Palmer, and they'd walk up to Old Wyldes together and call in on Linnell. Blake was working on his Dante illustrations. So he'd often take proofs of the Dante work up to be checked by Linnell. And also he'd go out onto the heath and do sketches for the illustrations. So he was both sketching and sketched. This is Linnell's. The image on the left here is my absolute favourite image of Blake. He's just absolutely wonderful, despite the fact that Linnell can't really do hands. This is him on the heath, in his hat, looking like Blake. And on the right, this is Blake and Varley having an animated discussion about something. Varley had, a while before this, had commissioned Blake to do the Spiritual Head series, which gives you an impression of Varley. And Varley was pretty bonkers, very interesting character, very, very heavily into astrology. And I think in this exchange that's going on, I think of the two of them, Blaine looks slightly less insane than Varley does. So Blake sketching on the heath. The image on the left here is John Constable's fir trees at Hampstead. Constable lived on the heath just before and around about the same time as Blake was visiting. The two are supposed to have met at some point. And so Constable was out there sketching. And I think you can see on the right, the Virgil painting, which is Blake. They look kind of similar. And what's interesting about this is during this period in the 1820s, 1810s, 1820s, Hampstead Heath was a heath. There were very few trees on it. And so painting trees, you didn't have many to choose from. And with a bit of sleuthing, Louisa on the ground, me looking at old maps, we kind of had to look at some old photographs, we had to look at some old maps, and we were able eventually, we think, to find on the right here, these firs, these fir trees, which are these trees here, which, and I'll go back a couple of slides, which I think are these trees that Blake painted. They look kind of similar. And if not, then, you know, I don't really care. They couldn't have cared. But they're called, they are the furs. They're by the Spaniards and we think that they are, if not the trees, then the descendants of the trees that Blake painted. They're the only trees that would have been anywhere near Collins's farm, Old Wyldes, when Blake was there. So yeah, one of the things I claim, we're claiming, is that we might have found these trees, and people at the time, Blake's friends, referred to these trees as Dante's wood, because Blake was, you know, using them as a model for Dante. So there we are, a little bit of unknown London landscape for you. I'll just show you a few images to wrap up, which I will do shortly, you'll be pleased to know. So this is the Thornton Virgil images of Blake's. Palmer actually had a copy of these images that Blake himself ran off for him. He loved them. He called them, and I'm trying to find the quote, he called them little nooks and corners of paradise. Basically, he thought these were some of the best images that anyone had ever, you know, created. I'm inclined to agree. And again, the sketchbook, you can kind of see that influence. But the influence came really out in these series of images that are now in the Ashmolean. They're called sepias, but they're kind of gum arabic and ink and all sorts of really weird media. They look like etchings. They're not etchings. They're ink and all sorts of chalk and all sorts of other media. But I think you can see, you know, they're kind of made to look a bit like woodcuts. They're very pastoral. Here's some bats and a full moon. You know, a bloke reading a book. Some sheep, sticks of corn. You know, this is very Blake. And then this is an ink and chalk image of Ruth returning from the gleaning. And again, you know, even when he's not thinking about making things look like prints, that figure straight out of Blake. I think, you know, the way that's been drawn. But he goes his own way. He starts thinking about colour. He starts thinking about, you know, Christian imagery. Coming from even in churches, still on display at the Tate. It survived the recent rehang. You know, that's woman in red leading some children out of and some bearded patriarchs out of the church behind some mountains. Magic apple tree on the right. You know, abundance. Piper piping to his flock. We've seen this before, but again, you know, rural peasantry. But this kind of, you know, the moon's almost sucking this guy, you know, to it, isn't it? He's just kind of sucking him in. And then he calms down a bit, but even so, you can still see there's that glimmer there of these people in this field as the sun's going down. Twilight time, people in glints of red, cottages with the lights on, getting ready to, you know, for people to return home. You could also do detail, you know. Some of his work was incredibly detailed. This barn with a mossy roof, he's, you know, just masterful. Oak trees in Luddingston Park. Again, the colour, the detail. This is on screen. This doesn't do it any justice whatsoever. This is vibrant piece of work. These ancient old trees, which I tried to find in Luddingston Park, and then realised that these trees in this image are 200, 300 years old at least, and they were painted 200 years ago, and that would make them amongst, if they still survive, some of the oldest trees in the country. They're not there anymore. I can tell you that these trees aren't there anymore. I've looked. And then so the etching that he did towards the end of his life, this is from his Milton series that he did. Again, look at the sky. The detail in here is incredible. You can see that got a Blake influence there, but it's something else as well. It's got elements of the classical world from his honeymoon in Italy. It's got the rural, thatched cottages things going on. It's referring, obviously, it's illustrating Milton. More Milton, more skies. Woman with a jug of water on her head. People ploughing into the night as the sun goes down over, whatever mountain range this is. But there's some incredible presence here, I think. And just sort of speak briefly about his legacy. He wasn't very successful in his lifetime. He was rediscovered in the 1920s by people from goldsmiths, mostly for his etchings, and etchings being popular in the 1920s. His paintings were discovered in the kind of 1960s and later, and now museums are complaining about the fact that art galleries and museums are complaining about the fact that they can't afford to buy them anymore. So this is someone who wasn't very successful in his lifetime to, going for £500,000 at auction not that long ago. And also in terms of the Blake legacy, Palmer was one of Alexander Gilchrist's informants for the Gilchrist biography. Gilchrist helped Palmer choose a gravestone for his dead son, and was in correspondence with him to quite late in his life. And also, in a related Gilchrist anecdote, which relates to this slide, Gilchrist, I've got to get the story right. So Gilchrist contacted Dante Gabriel Rossetti because Rossetti had a notebook of Blake's which Gilchrist wanted to have a look at. Now, Rossetti had bought this from a contact at the British Museum, and it's not very clear, and somebody could probably tell me this, I don't know. It's not very clear whether it was bought out of the British Museum's collection or whether it was brokered by someone from the British Museum, from a private individual. The person that brokered the sale, in any case, wherever it came from, was a certain William Palmer, who was Samuel Palmer's brother. So, the Blake's everywhere in Palmer's life, and that's a kind of. I think I'm going to end with dodgy dealings from Palmer's brother and Blake's manuscript. But I'll end with this. Nightbird Press, In Search of Paradise. If you're outside the UK and you want to buy it, look at Treadwell's website. They can handle overseas orders. Louisa at Nightbird is a one-person operation and isn't geared up for overseas exports, basically. Treadwell's bookshops, other good bookshops in London, but buy it from Louisa if you can, because obviously that way she makes more money out of it, and we could all do with that. Other Blake merchandise is available from Nightbird Press. She's not making me say this. Very good Blake's Mystic Map of London. That's excellent. There might be other stuff coming out. There's all sorts of other things about. There's a pamphlets on the Brontes, Virginia Woolf, other women authors, and really, really good stuff. So do try and patronise Louisa if you can. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully John is going to rejoin us. And I hope that was all right, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I'd like to say, just while John's getting himself together, thank you so much to Louisa for inviting me to contribute to the pamphlet. It was a brilliant process, really enjoyed it, and we had quite an interesting time putting it together. And thanks to the Blake Society for supporting it through Vala and through inviting me to give this talk. And I hope I haven't gone on too long, and I hope it was of some interest. And so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was an incredibly full and fascinating description of Palmer's life and work, and how he related to the other ancients, and of course to Blake. I am entranced by the idea of you looking through his glasses, which that must happen. And also, I didn't think of Blake as a glasses wearer, so I'm very intrigued by the idea that Palmer got William's glasses. There we go.
Apparently they were in really poor condition and really messed it up. And apparently he did towards the end of his life. He didn't wear them all the time, but he did wear them. So, there you go.
It's funny, I suppose if you don't see him in a painting, you know, in an oil painting wearing the glasses, it doesn't occur to you, but makes perfect sense. We have run over a little bit, what with the AGM and David's fascinating talk, but I think we should let people ask a few questions if they want to. Easiest way to do so is to put your sort of virtual hand up in the reactions bit on Zoom. If you want to ask any questions, and we'll maybe just do 2 or 3. There was a question from Jody in the chat as well, which I think the fount of all knowledge, Kerry Davies, has responded to. But I thought I might just ask Jody's question to you, David, anyway, if I can find it. Yeah, Jody says, could you give some specific examples of the Christian mysticism the ancients were into, specific movements, authors, etc.?
Off the top of my head right now, no. I could pick a book off that bookshelf there and find it. I mean, to be honest, personally, I've not delved into it that far. It's kind of something that is superficially interesting to me, but I'm not that interested in delving into it. It's yeah, I'm more interested in what that produced rather than the beliefs themselves. You know what I mean? It's a massive rabbit hole that I'd rather not go down. So I'm sorry. I really sort of in terms of their absolute, belief systems. I'm really not qualified to comment on that.
No problem. I'm just sort of scanning the chat. Paula Tate tells us there's a Samuel Palmer exhibition currently on at Sevenoaks.
Oh yeah. This is what's his name? There's an artist whose name completely escaped me. He's really Kit Boyd, I think. He has done a whole series of Palmer influenced, and he's very Palmer influenced himself, railway station posters for the line that goes through Shoreham. And I think there's an exhibition of that and some local artists as well in Shoreham at the moment. So if you're in Shoreham or close to Shoreham, then I think that's probably worth patronising.
Absolutely. I must go to Shoreham. I can't see any hands raised, but I must ask you while I have the opportunity, David, about the book, where you're at with it, and how you got writing a book on Samuel Palmer, and when we should look out for it.
Well, it's a bit of a strange one and probably too long a story to go into right now, but I've been writing it for getting on for 10 years because of strange let's as we're in the Blake site, strange emanations which happened, and just all sorts of weird things, which eventually I just had to write this book. And so it's taking a quite a personal view of Palmer. It deals with his life, but it deals with the life of those around him and his family, and also with his wife, who was actually an artist as well. And kind of there's a Catherine Blake element to Hannah, and then his legacy. So there's a whole legacy of his from the neo-romantics with like Nash and that lot, through to the Brotherhood of Ruralists in the 70s with another Blake, but Peter Blake, and they were heavily influenced by Palmer, and talking about actually his relationship to me, which may or may not, possibly be one, and it doesn't matter if there is or isn't. There definitely is now.
As in a genealogical relationship, or
possibly. That's all. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about it, but the whole thing kicked off from a possible thing in the family. But the book's nearly written. I need to go and see through his spectacles at the V&A. It's not far off manuscript. I'm hoping to get it finished this year. And then if anyone knows of a good agent or or a publisher who wants to publish a weird semi-biographical, autobiographical, landscape-based art historical thing, I could probably sell it better than that.
I don't know. There you are, everyone. The challenge has been laid. There you are. The aforementioned Kerry Davies has joined us. Kerry, do you have a question for David?
Well, it's not really a question. It just, the course of David's talk, I thought this is an opportunity to pay some tribute to Raymond Lister, remarkable man. He left school at the age of 14, not because he was impoverished, but because his family required him to do a blacksmithing apprenticeship before he could take over the family firm. It's so no academic background at all, really, but very good blacksmith, I understand, and also a miniature painter. But his work on Palmer, I think, rescued Palmer to British. The writers in the 50s and 60s, Geoffrey Grigson, had a very, very narrow view of Palmer. It's with Raymond Lister that we get the sense of the late etchings as a visionary captured. And of course, Raymond Lister was the man who spotted Tom Keating's fakes. He was never taken in by the Tom Keating fakes, and you can point to a number of distinguished museum curators who were totally taken. So I just wanted to make this a tribute to the memory of Raymond Lister, who I met a couple of times 30 years ago. Oh, dear me. Yes, he was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. There are a couple more questions in the chat, which I might read out. And then if there are no more raised virtual hands, perhaps we'll call it a night then. So Eric Nicholson says, flocks of sheep seem a common theme. Is that merely a rustic symbol, or is there more to it than that?
I think you can read it various ways, can't you? I mean, one of the key Christian, bits of iconography is of the shepherd, Christ as shepherd, the flock of, as the congregation. And I think that's definitely a reference to the wider sort of Christian iconography. And it happens to be pastoral, and it happens to fit into that whole sort of, wandering around the countryside, the English countryside as well. So I think there's multiple layers to it, but the Christian symbolism is definitely part of that.
There's definitely, as you mentioned in your talk, that I think there's a definite sort of Blake visual echo with the sheep, isn't there? The way the sheep from Songs of Innocence and Experience, well, they almost look like a sort of like a group of sheep that you could just move en masse on wheels. Maybe they're almost a sort of structure. And a question from Nick Robbins, who asks, David, any thoughts on the political dynamics of Blake and Palmer? Palmer was a deep opponent of reform. Yeah,
I think it's interesting that, because the only thing that there's this document that Palmer wrote, which is been interpreted as being deeply kind of deeply Tory, which it kind of is, in a sense, but in the sense that they were the only political party at the time. The Labour Party hadn't been invented. The Liberals weren't really a force, and it was a time of rural unrest. You know, there's the Captain Swing riots going on. Quite close to Shoreham, actually, there were ricks being burnt and so on. So there was definite rural unrest. And I think Palmer, yeah, he was privileged, property owning and the rest of it. But I think he was coming at that from a kind of wanting the rural poor to kind of, in a sense, know their place, absolutely, but in a sense, kind of be cared for as well, and be kind of, you know, he had a kind of a vision of the peasantry as essentially being kind of patronized by the rich who kind of would look after them, and in a rural economy, you know, they kind of you know, very naive idea that people would, you know, essentially, it's not egalitarian, but a relationship with the land and with the upper class, which was kind of paternalistic, which isn't, you know, it's a very romantic view, and I don't think a very accurate one. But I think that's led to kind of Palmer being seen as a lot more reactionary than perhaps he was. But I think, yeah, you definitely would have disagreed with Blake. I think, you know, they were very different, yeah, politically coming from very different points of view. But I think they also had potentially a lot of common ground in the, you know, they were both very concerned about people and how people got on in the world, and that people were cared for and looked after. And I think that Palmer's way of achieving that was probably naive, probably a bit wrong-headed, but coming from a place which was, you know, of concern, as opposed to kind of a place of trying to kind of oppress people and put them down, and that they should, you know, be in their place, and they should just not complain about, you know, dying in poverty. You know?
I guess it's also interesting with thinking about the influence of Blake on, you know, on someone's life later on, but the time in which they actually knew each other. Obviously, Blake's at the end of his life with the views that he had then, and Palmer's, you know, a youth basically. And so it's yeah, comparing people at different ends of their lives is interesting in all sorts of ways. Yeah. I don't think there are any more questions. Lots of people in the chat saying how much they've enjoyed the talk. Colin says, thanks, David, brought Samuel Palmer back to life for me. We'll dig out my books on him and reread. You can't say better than that, can you? But I think we should probably call it a night there. So thank you once again, David, for a fascinating talk. Brilliant. I would also just like to second David's comments on Louisa's pamphlet and on her work generally. Do go and check out her stuff. It's absolutely wonderful stuff in terms of the ideas and the lives and the literary figures she's making work about, but and also her artwork is just astonishing. And I wish I could afford some original Louisa artwork. And also, as it's our AGM, thank you to all of you, all of our members, for making the Blake Society what it is and enabling us to do what we do. If you are not a member and you're interested in becoming one, have a look at our website, blakesociety.org, and it's all very straightforward to do. And as Stephen said in the AGM, any general feedback or comments, the easiest way to get in touch with us is to email secretary@blakesociety.org. I think I've got that right. I'm going to go now and build an altar to Pan in my back garden. But I hope to see you all soon and see you in February for our next event with Jason Wright. But for now, thank you very much and good night to you all.